Hi, my name is Tess, and today I've put together a quick demonstration of two techniques you can use when painting watercolor portraits. We're going to start off with an explanation of each technique in isolation, and then we're going to see how it can actually be applied in the portrait painting process. Let's get started.
Now, I want to start off by saying that there's no one right way to paint a portrait. Even when only considering watercolor as a medium, your options for stylistic approach and expression are virtually limitless. Watercolor paints offer a rich variety of effects, all of which can be employed to create compelling and visually interesting portraits. A portrait doesn't need to be photorealistic to be convincing, yet it can be very helpful to know how to create smooth and lifelike skin tones using watercolor pigments. In this demo, I will be showing techniques I often use in order to create the appearance of even and fairly realistic skin. Watercolor is famously chaotic and difficult to control. Blotches, burns, diffusion patterns. All of these watercolor effects bring character and life to your paintings. And it can be difficult to paint a realistic portrait when working with these unruly effects, so it's good to have more predictable techniques to work with as well. To this end, it's going to be all about gradients today, and how to create and control them. I think about watercolor painting as creating a collection of gradient shapes. Drawing and sketching tend to be about lines, and painting tends to be about making shapes. Watercolor in particular lends itself a step further. Instead of just creating shapes, we can easily make gradient shapes by using the diffusion properties of pigment in water. By layering gradient shapes and controlling their edges, we can start to build up multi-tonal layers and create the appearance of smooth and even skin tones in a portrait. Let's look at our first technique, creating a multichromatic gradient shape with hard edges. So, what does this even mean? Well, here's the vector calculus definition of a gradient. Just kidding. Gradient means our colors will gradually fade into one another, creating a smooth transition. That gradiated area will describe a shape, and the painted shape itself will have hard edges rather than softly blending into the paper. Here, I'm creating a single color gradient shape with hard edges. Multichromatic, in this case, just means that we're using more than one color. So we're going to do the same thing I just did, but we're going to deposit several colors of concentrated pigment into the wet painted area. Watch how they diffuse into each other, creating relatively smooth transitions from one colored area to another. The trick here is to work wet. Once the paper starts to dry, we'll start seeing burn marks, pooling, and other cool, but in this case undesirable effects. You should work quickly, and you can also mist your painted area to give yourself a bit more time. The other trick is to leave it alone. Get your pigment about where you want it, and then sit on your hands until it's dry. Or go take a nice walk. If you're impatient and you add dilute pigment to a half-dry area, as I'm doing here, you'll end up with burn marks as the water lifts and disrupts the pigment that has already settled in the paper. Watch out for adding a more diluted pigment to a wet area already painted with concentrated pigment. The extra water will start to push the pigments around, and you can get unpredictable patterns. I always start with the lightest and most diluted layer of pigment, and then add progressively more and more concentrated pigment to build up the color. This results in the least disruption of your gradient. If you're following along at home, take some time to practice this technique in isolation. See how many colors you can add before your painted area gets muddy, and experiment with how different types of paper will affect the outcome. You'll also find that your pigments will interact with each other in different ways. Some will seem to push other pigments around, and some will blend in smoothly with no fuss. While this aspect of watercolor may feel unpredictable, it's actually more reliable than you might think, and there's no better way to get a handle on the idiosyncrasies of the medium than to relentlessly experiment with it. Now, let's see how this can help us paint a portrait. For my first layer, I wet the whole area of the face and neck, saving any areas that I want to keep white. And then I drop in concentrated pigments to create that smooth gradient with hard edges. I'm starting off with both warm and cool pigments, because these are the underlying tones in my subject's skin. While my working area is quite wet, the added pigments smoothly diffuse. If left to dry undisturbed, this will create an even, multichromatic gradient on the paper. Working quickly and misting lightly to keep my working area wet, I now start to add deeper blues and purples to the shadowed area of the face and neck.
At this point, my working area begins to dry, so it's time to leave this layer alone and let it dry out completely before I continue. You can already see a bit of rough texture developing on the right side of the face where the paper has become too dry, and the paint that I'm adding is starting to cause an uneven burn pattern instead of smoothly diffusing. While this initial layer is wet, the colors do look pretty outlandish. But take a look once it's dried. Those pigments are actually pretty light. My rule of thumb when painting with watercolor: if it looks right when it's wet, it's definitely too light. Now I have a smooth base to work with. To bring the portrait to life, I'm going to apply consecutive layers of smooth gradient shapes in order to build up the color and contour of the subject's face. This brings us to our next technique, which looks almost exactly like our first one, except this time we want to control the edges of our gradient shapes very carefully. Technique number 2 is to create gradient shapes with a mix of hard and soft edges. Because we're trying to create the illusion of a smooth, skin-like surface, we want to be able to add pigment without leaving hard edges all over the place. Let's make some more gradient shapes, and I'll show you 4 ways to soften and control those edges. Here's a gradient shape with one soft edge. The top part of the teardrop is pretty crisp, but the bottom edge is very soft, smoothly blending into the paper. Here's a gradient shape with no edges, just a soft spot of color diffusing out from the center. As this patch dries, the edges will get even softer. Here are those 2 shapes, after they've dried. When I want to soften an edge, I usually do it one of 4 ways. The first and most obvious way to create a soft edge is to paint your shape, then blot the edge in question. A paper towel is a good way to do this. However, it can be difficult to control how much pigment and water is picked up by the paper towel, so I generally prefer to use a brush as a blotter. This is method number 2. Here, I'm applying full-strength pigment to the paper, and then I wash my brush fully, blot most of the water out of it, and then gently lift the pigment from one edge. This has to be done quite quickly, before the painted area begins to dry, and the brush must be just the right level of damp. Too much water and the pigment already on the paper will flow to a new area. Too little, and the pigment won't lift evenly. This method offers a lot more control than the paper towel approach, but it can take a bit of practice to get a sense of how saturated your brush needs to be. Another method is to apply diluted pigment to the paper, then drop quite concentrated pigment onto the shape on the edge that does not need to be soft. With this method, you're at the mercy of diffusion, so keep an eye on the shape as it dries to make sure the soft edge stays soft. Finally, what do you do if you decide you don't want an edge to a shape that has already dried? Depending on the pigment, it's usually possible to scrub an edge out using a stiff, damp brush or a clean, damp paper towel. However, this can create a bit of a patchy effect, so I only really recommend this for remedial efforts. Here's what those test patches look like once dry. You can see that the brush blotted and diffused shapes have the smoothest gradient. Alright, let's look at this in application. Now I'm going to show you how to use this technique to build up a portrait by adding contour, value, and depth. Here we are back at the dried base layer, this time with bonus background. I'm starting to pick out shadows and contours on the face, building up those gradient shapes and lifting or blotting edges to soften the transitions where needed. Even when working on detailed areas like the eyelid folds, I'm still thinking about creating shapes and not lines. Here, the top eyelid of my subject is described by a long, curved and tapered shape that is a warm red-brown on the outside and fades to a cooler and bluer shade towards the inner corner of the eye. This creates the illusion of depth and roundness in the portrait. You can see where I have used the same technique under the eye as well, employing a mix of hard and soft edges to create folds in my subject's skin. The rest of the portrait is really just a continuation of this technique, applied over and over. I examine the reference photo carefully and pick out areas that need more warmth or more shadow, and I layer these gradient shapes on top of one another, softening or keeping edges where needed so that the layers blend and create contour. At this stage, I always work wet over dry. If I were to add watery pigment to a damp area, I'd start to get burns and unpredictable effects. Which is not to say these effects are bad, it's just not what we're going for at this moment. Skipping over the next few hours of fiddly layering, here we are at the final product. I've used other techniques in this painting,
but my main approach to creating skin tone is as I have laid out in this demo, by carefully layering controlled wet-on-dry gradients to create the overall smooth and translucent effect of my subject's skin. Thanks for watching.